Good morning.
Hello.
Who is Jamie Angus and how did your foray into journalism begin?
So I first joined the BBC nearly 19 years ago. So I had been working in politics a bit. So I'd worked in Westminster and the UK Parliament and for a few years. And then I joined the BBC as a researcher on our breakfast radio programme called the Today programme, which is the sort of national main politics and news programme on the radio in the UK. And then I've worked ever since in the BBC, sometimes in the World Service, sometimes in domestic news. Before I was the director of the World Service, I was the editor of the Today programme, so I was on the domestic side, then moved back to the global side. And I've had lots of previous involvement in the World Service over the years. So I've always had a really keen interest in what we do globally and a real sort of ambition to lead this part of the organisation, because the BBC's global mission to reach ultimately to reach 500 million people weekly in multiple languages across the globe. It's just such an important part of what the BBC exists to do, and it's a real pleasure to be leading that.
Okay, how's the journey been?
Well, what specifically on the World Service?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we have adopted a very ambitious audience target, which is that our Director General Tony Hall said that by the BBC's centennial year, by our 100th anniversary in 2022, that we should reach 500 million people a week, and we're currently at 360, something like that. So we're doing all right, but part of the reason that these language expansion, the new language services are so important to us is that it enables us to reach all these new audiences who probably wouldn't otherwise have consumed BBC News content and stories. And so, specifically here in Nigeria, for Igbo and Yoruba, and also to an extent Pidgin, there are listeners and readers online now who are getting BBC News who would never really have consumed it in English or in Hausa, which is the other language we've operated in here. So I think that is a really exciting part of our mission, that we would genuinely reach people globally and here in West Africa who've never really seen BBC News content before, and that's just a really great privilege and really exciting part of what we're doing.
Okay. In a snapshot, you used to be the deputy director of the World Service Group.
Yes, that's right.
And you're now the director.
Yeah, I'm the director. Yeah.
How is the role different from?
Well, I was working as the deputy, and my then boss, Fran Unsworth, she is now the director of the whole of BBC News. So she's my big boss. And I suppose I was more involved as deputy director in the day-to-day running of our commercial news company. So we run a commercial company called BBC Global News Limited that is responsible for the BBC World News channel and our website in English. And we run those as quite a heavily commercialised operation. So I spent probably more time last year working on the English side of the output. But I always had an interest in the new language services, and at this time of unprecedented expansion, I've been particularly enjoying focusing more as this week on these new language services and what we can bring to the West African Nigerian news market.
With a weekly audience of 372 million, why is the BBC keen on expansion?
Why? Well, as I said earlier, partly it's because we've set ourselves a target, just because we think the BBC's global reach is one of its public purposes so the UK licence fee payer, who pays for a lot of the BBC, has a stake in the BBC being a really highly visible news content provider around the world, and that benefits people in the UK, it benefits the UK licence fee payer, and more widely everyone who pays their taxes in the UK, because it means that British people are well received around the world because of the quality of the BBC's content. But it also means that somewhere like here in Nigeria, where we're investing heavily in recruiting local journalists, the insight that they provide us as a news organisation really benefits viewers in the UK. So my contention is that UK audiences will benefit hugely from the expansion here, even though a lot of the content is in languages they can't or won't understand. So there's a sort of benefit to everyone here. There's a benefit to the quality of our journalism, to audiences in Nigeria and to audiences in the UK.
Okay, good. If my memory serves me right, some years ago the BBC wasn't keen on expansion.
Was keen or wasn't
keen on
expansion.
What changed?
So I think, one of the important things is that the World Service has had an additional investment in it from the UK government in the last 2.5-3 years to open these additional 11 language services, including the 3 that we're talking about today. And that was kind of additional money on top of the existing World Service money that gave us the ability to expand. I think it wasn't that we weren't keen on expanding, it was just that we had a fixed pot of revenue and we had to focus very carefully what we spent it on. And we agreed with the government nearly 3 years ago now to expand the number of language services because we felt that these audiences wouldn't ever be reached in English, and that it was an important part of the BBC's global mission to expand our news coverage into those new languages. And so that's why we're, excitingly, everything you can see around you is a product of that investment, a commitment to be a player, a partner in this market here, alongside your strong media houses. So for example, we're talking about our Channels TV co-production that we're going to launch later this year, a weekly half-hour news show, topical news show. And that's a really good example of where we have a trusted local partner. It's a full co-production. It embodies the best of what they can bring and the best of what we can bring. And that's the sort of partnership model that the BBC likes to follow here in Nigeria and elsewhere.
Okay, with 41 language services, where would you say you have the largest audiences?
Okay. I can probably get this one. So actually here in Nigeria, so Nigeria is our single largest country market. So we've got 36 million a week in Nigeria across all the language. Well, that's measured currently Hausa and English only because we haven't measured the audiences yet. So Hausa and English gives us 36 million a week. It's our single largest country audience, bigger even than the US. And that's why Nigeria is incredibly important to the BBC. So we, sorry, remind me your question. I've slightly lost my phone.
What are the new language services of the BBC and why the focus on these languages?
Right, yeah, exactly. So we've got this we're very proud of our long history of broadcasting in Hausa. And the Hausa audience is 19 million a week and is still, I think, the BBC's single largest language audience. It's an unbelievably resilient and important service, which is still mainly shortwave radio, but also to an extent the digital side. And it's been a sort of historical anomaly that the BBC has broadcast in Hausa but not in Igbo, Yoruba and also Pidgin. And it's fantastic that we're able to correct that anomaly and extend our language services to the 4 main languages of Nigeria, if you like. Obviously Pidgin's slightly different, but it's a West African language. And that's good because that means that all Nigerian language groups will be better served by BBC News than they were before.
To the next question, what are your important platforms for digital growth in Nigeria and West Africa? What are the important platforms for digital growth for the BBC?
So at the moment we run our own website, so BBC Hausa. bbc.com/Hausa and bbc.com/Yoruba Pidgin. I've got the URLs right. I'm reading the wrong one. But also, we also operate on the major social platforms, so particularly on Facebook here in West Africa, a very popular platform. And we also, to some extent, syndicate our content with local partners. So we are interested in developing partnerships with local digital publishers who would syndicate BBC content onto their platform. That's part of how we operate around the globe. We don't just have a walled garden on our own platforms. We share it through third-party providers' platforms, sometimes on a commercial basis and sometimes just for reach. And that's part of our plans here in Nigeria. We want to build the audiences for these new language websites, but that will take time, and it'll probably involve local partners as well as the direct site.
Why online? Why not the old way of doing things, shortwave?
Sure.
Yeah, why online?
Well, we're doing both. We're still doing radio. So we're doing the BBC Minute, 1 minute international news summary. It's running on FM stations in Igbo, Yoruba, Pidgin, and have we got a Hausa one? I can't remember. Anyway, so we're still doing radio summaries. We're keeping Hausa shortwave radio because it's so valuable to us, as I said. And we're also increasingly doing increased TV content this year. So one of the things we'll be doing, as well as the channel's co-production, we're also making original investigative journalism available to selected partners in Nigeria. We're doing business, sport, children's news programming, some satire. We're expanding into non-live TV programming that we will also make available to selected partners in Nigeria. So those sort of what people sometimes call legacy platforms, the radio and TV, are just massively important to us still. But we do see that in the very long term, audiences will shift to digital, and we know that we have to build a presence and a reputation there. So we're doing all of those things simultaneously. It's not about raising digital up ahead of all the others, but we do need to transform as a news organisation, as I'm sure the Guardian Group will be familiar with this, channels will be familiar with this. All journalism organisations are on a journey to a digital future, but it's a question of how long does it take to get there, and sustaining and growing your linear audiences on TV and radio in the meantime.
How do you intend to build a loyal customer base for the Nigerian languages? Yeah,
well, that's a very good question, and I think, to be honest, that is a challenge for us, that we've only just launched these services, so they're really new, right? But what we already see is that people will come to us for one article, but what we want is to build a longer and more enduring relationship with audiences, so that they will come back weekly or monthly for multiple visits. And that's hard. Nigeria is a vibrant, well-served media market in many ways, and although digital is growing, we will have to fight and jostle just as hard as other providers to make a real impact on digital platforms. And that's why we're interested in working in partnership with other digital publishers here, because we will always be able to build our own audience on our own platform. But to grow quickly, I think we have to work in partnership with others.
From your perspective, do you think there's a gap in the Nigerian market for high-quality international news coverage?
Yes, there is a gap, particularly for that international segment. So the Nigerian market covers national and regional issues well. The BBC will continue to cover regional and national issues across its digital platforms and on the radio, because we do think that, as the most trusted international news provider, there are times when audiences in Nigeria will turn to the BBC for the definitive version of a particular story. So there was a fake news story which had wrongly published the death of the president, for example, and the BBC was able to very definitively say that this was an untrue fake news story. So there are moments when people will turn to the BBC for big global news stories and big breaking international news, but we also want to serve audiences here with, if you like, near news content, so content that helps people understand the issues in the news, that also addresses stories that are underrepresented in the Nigerian market. So we're particularly interested in gender balance, so publishing better and more effectively stories that are of interest to women audiences, because we think there is a deficit for that in the market that the BBC can help address. And also other types of stories about things that might be taboo or maybe just undercovered in the local market. That's part of the BBC's mission, is to lead in that way. And we think that through having a wide offer like that covers kind of near news, does sport, technology, medicine, business, entrepreneurship, as well as kind of Donald Trump, North Korea, that we need that kind of broad mix of stories, and also innovative digital treatments. So good digital video, captioned video, social stuff that's optimized for social platforms. That's how you build an audience. You can't just build an audience on international breaking news.
Interesting. A follow-up question. In the 21st century media sphere of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, how can a media firm stand out to being a credible source of information?
Well, that's why I've said that countering fake news is one of my strategic priorities in 2018 for the whole of World Service Group. And the reason for that is that through our language services, we have an unprecedented ability to spot fake news stories, particularly egregious fake news stories, and call them out on the BBC platform. And actually, I think we should seize that opportunity and not shy away from it. And so sometimes it's like seeing a bogus story, like someone saying that the president has died when he hasn't. Sometimes it's people faking BBC News. So people make fake BBC News reports and put the pictures with our logo on and put different audio on them and share them. And I think so one of the really interesting things that's happening now is that these types of stories are being shared on chat apps, so they're not even being shared on Facebook or on desktop platforms. They're being circulated on hand-to-hand on chat apps. And it's very difficult to spot them because those chat apps, if you're on WhatsApp or something similar, it's a private service. You can't search it. And I think the BBC is really well placed to lead in terms of spotting stories and calling them out, but also to help globally with this idea of global media literacy. So the idea that as digital publishing has expanded so fast, people's understanding of what is trustworthy and what isn't hasn't quite caught up. And the BBC has a central role to play in helping to explain to audiences how to evaluate news and which news outlets to trust. Now, obviously, we want people to trust us, and we think we already have that value associated with us. We are the most trusted international news brand. But it's part of how the BBC can help globally as a media player is to develop with local partners, like how do you tackle global media literacy?
How would you describe the involvement of news reporting?
News reporting.
No.
Well, as you can see around you, we've made a significant investment, over 100 jobs, in essentially national journalism and regional journalism for Nigeria and West Africa, based here in Lagos, across the 4 languages in total. And that's because we think that there's no substitute for going on the ground, reporting stories and basing your journalism on actual expertise. So the new journalists we've hired here will help audiences in the UK understand Nigeria better. There's a strong diaspora link between Nigeria and the UK. So there's a real thirst for high quality information about Nigeria. But also we think we can't report Nigeria effectively from London or just one regional base, so it's important for us to have West Africa coverage, mainly from Lagos, but also in Abuja. We have a big bureau in Dakar. We're sort of on the ground in more African countries than any other international broadcaster. And that's because we believe in the value of going to places and looking for facts and reporting them. And that may feel a bit old-fashioned sometimes, but it's something we feel very passionate about.
Interesting. So the next question, in your opinion, what tools have disrupted the way news?
Sorry, what
tools?
Tools, oh, okay.
Yeah. What tools have disrupted the way news is being reported?
Have disrupted, yeah. So interestingly, I think I mentioned this earlier, that maybe it was in the previous interview. So digital news is really exciting in lots of ways because it reduces the cost of entry to the market to almost zero. So 10, 15 years ago, you would have to buy a chain of newspapers, printing presses, a TV channel in order to get into the news business. Digital has transformed that, and it means that anyone can start publishing news for nothing, effectively. But the downside of that And so the upside of that is that it is easier now than ever before to reach new audiences if you're a quality news publisher, because you just can push stuff out onto social platforms. People might see it, they might like it, they might come back for more. The downside of that is that there is a real quality and trust deficit now. So there is just too much low quality content being published, either for fraud reasons, so it's kind of ad fraud, it's clickbait, ad fraud, fake news, or because it's politically motivated, malicious fake news content. And that is the huge conundrum about digital publishing. It has massive benefits, but it also has real it poses a real challenge to people's safety and security, because we see fake news stories that aren't just Donald Trump saying CNN is fake news. They're fake news that deliberately sets out to foment tension between ethnic groups, intercommunal tension and violence. And this is pernicious, right? It's dangerous. It's not just a kind of media talking point. It's a real threat to people's security and well-being, and that's the big challenge of fake news and digital publishing.
Interesting. And the next question: a plethora of global media firms are operating paywall.
Yeah.
Why isn't the BBC doing likewise?
Right. Well, so the TV channel in English, the World News Channel, and the English website bbc.com/news are commercialised in the sense that they are carry advertising. And actually, the TV channel, in a sense, is a paywalled product because it sits on a subscription. It's on DSTV, so it kind of subscription, right? You don't just get it for free everywhere. So the BBC's always had a few different ways of reaching audiences. But I think what's interesting about the World Service model is that a lot of our activity is not for profit. It's not commercialised. It's essentially done for reach, just to maximise our global audience. And it does that because of the investment of the UK licence fee payer and the UK government in the World Service. So I'm not saying that there would never be a world where, we would extend, micropayments or paywalls. I mean, every digital publisher in the world is thinking about these issues, and we think about them a lot. But what's different for us is that we're not solely there to make a profit. So the profit imperative is not as great for the BBC World Service as it is in some other areas. And so that allows us to continue to give away content effectively for nothing in the interest of growing our audience, and that's what we're primarily doing here.
Interesting. So the final question: what's the title of the book you're currently reading?
Sorry, the book I'm currently reading. Oh, right, okay. So I'm currently reading. It's the Robert Harris book about Cicero, and it's a trilogy. And
you're reading the third one?
Well, I read the third one. The first one, I think, is called Imperium. So it's a historical novel about Cicero, and it's by a British author called Robert Harris.
I can mail you the details.